Before we begin, I want you to imagine something. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, standing in front of your own home, holding your own keys, looking at your own family, and realizing you don't recognize a single one of them. Not because you were injured, not because you became ill, but because somewhere, someone, or something quietly took every memory you ever had. There is an old story told in the hills of Vermont. Most people dismiss it as another forgotten local legend, a tale passed from one generation to the next. The kind of story that only appears on rainy evenings, whispered beside a fireplace. But according to county records, there really was a house that stood alone at the edge of black pine forest. No fences, no neighbors, no electricity, only silence. For more than 100 years, people visited that house. Travelers, historians, surveyors, even curious teenagers looking for an adventure. Almost every one of them returned, but none of them returned the same. They remembered the road. They remembered the weather. They remembered the front porch. They remembered opening the old wooden door. But after that, their memories became strangely incomplete. Names disappeared. Faces faded. Entire years of their lives simply vanished. Doctors couldn't explain it. Psychologists couldn't explain it. Even the people who experienced it struggled to describe what had happened inside. They all repeated one sentence, exactly the same sentence. The house remembered me, so I no longer had to. Tonight, we're going to follow the footsteps of the last man who willingly walked through that front door. A historian who believed every mystery had a logical explanation. He carried notebooks, old maps, a camera, and enough confidence to believe that legends belonged in books, not in real life. He expected to spend one quiet evening documenting an abandoned home. Instead, he became the final person to write about it, because the notebook he left behind was found, but the man who wrote it was never truly the same again. So dim the lights, settle into a comfortable place, and step carefully into the story of the house that forgot every visitor.
Good evening. Tonight's story begins with a simple question. What if a place could remember you better than you could remember yourself? Not your name, not your face, but every laugh you had forgotten, every fear you buried, every promise you never kept. Imagine walking into a house for only one night and leaving the next morning with your entire life still in front of you, but none of it feeling like it belonged to you. There are no monsters in tonight's story, no creatures hiding beneath the stairs, no sudden screams waiting in the darkness. Only an old wooden house standing quietly among towering pine trees where silence has been collecting for more than a century. Most people have never heard of Black Pine Forest. It doesn't appear in travel magazines. It isn't marked on postcards. Even long-time residents of Vermont rarely mention it, and when they do, they speak about it only in passing, almost as though saying too much might invite unwanted attention. Near the center of that forgotten forest, where the trees grow so close together that sunlight struggles to reach the ground, stands an old farmhouse. No mailbox, no electricity, no neighbors for miles. Just weathered wood, a crooked front porch, and windows that reflect the forest instead of the sky. Locals have always called it the Memory House. No one remembers who gave it that name. They simply accept it, like rain, like winter, like something that has always existed. For decades, strange stories surrounded the house. Travelers claimed they entered out of curiosity, only to leave feeling that something precious had been left behind. Some forgot childhood birthdays, others forgot their wedding day. One retired teacher could still solve advanced mathematics, yet no longer recognize the faces of her own students after teaching them for 30 years. Doctors blamed stress, psychologists blamed trauma, families blamed age. But those explanations never seemed to fit, because every visitor described exactly the same feeling. Not pain, not fear, not confusion, just absence, as if someone had quietly removed a single thread and the rest of their memories slowly began to unravel around it. County officials investigated the property several times. Nothing unusual was found. No chemicals, no hidden rooms, no dangerous gas leaks. The house appeared perfectly ordinary, old, abandoned, silent. Eventually, the investigation stopped. The reports were archived. The road leading toward the forest slowly disappeared beneath weeds and fallen leaves. Nature reclaimed everything, or almost everything, because every few years someone always found the house again, usually by accident. Usually because curiosity has always been stronger than common sense. The last documented visitor arrived in late October of 1978. His name was Daniel Mercer, 36 years old, a respected historian from Boston. Daniel wasn't interested in ghost stories. He spent his career proving that legends usually began with simple misunderstandings. An old rumor became local folklore. A forgotten accident became a supernatural tale. Fear, he often said, grows best where facts grow weakest. His lectures at the university were popular because he never mocked old stories. Instead, he explained them, patiently, carefully, piece by piece. When a colleague mentioned the abandoned farmhouse in Vermont, Daniel smiled. He said, "There will be a logical explanation. There always is." 3 weeks later, he packed his station wagon. Inside were cameras, fresh notebooks, audio recording equipment, several rolls of film, historical maps dating back to the 1880s, enough food for 3 days, and a small cassette recorder he used for personal observations. He planned to document the property, record its history, and finally separate fact from fiction. The drive north took nearly 8 hours. The farther he traveled, the quieter the roads became. Small towns appeared less often. Gas stations grew farther apart. Radio stations dissolved into static. Clouds drifted low across the mountains. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of worn silver. Daniel stopped at the final general store before entering Black Pine Forest. The building looked as though it had survived several generations without changing at all. A wooden porch, old rocking chairs, handwritten price tags. Inside, an elderly woman stood behind the counter reading a newspaper. She looked up as the bell above the door rang. "You heading into the forest?" Daniel smiled politely. "I am." She nodded slowly. "I thought so." He placed a map on the counter. "I'm looking for an abandoned farmhouse." The woman's expression changed, not dramatically, just enough for Daniel to notice. "You found the road? It took a while. It usually does." Daniel laughed softly. "I've heard there are quite a few stories about the place." "There are. I suppose most aren't true." The woman folded her newspaper. "I've lived here for 71 years. Daniel waited. She continued quietly. "I've learned something about stories. They don't have to be true to leave something behind." Silence settled between them. Finally, she reached beneath the counter. She placed an old brass key beside his map. Its surface was dark with age. "I don't know if it still fits." Daniel frowned. "You've been there?" She shook her head. "No. It was returned here 40 years ago." "By who?" "I don't remember." For the first time that day, Daniel felt something unusual. Not fear, only curiosity. A deeper kind of curiosity, the kind that historians spend their entire lives chasing. He thanked the woman, paid for a thermos of coffee, collected the old key, and drove toward the forest. Neither of them noticed that she never charged him for the key. The paved road ended 20 minutes later. Gravel replaced asphalt, then dirt replaced gravel. Eventually, there was no road at all, just 2 narrow tire tracks disappearing beneath towering pine trees. The forest felt strangely still. No birds, no wind. Even the leaves seemed reluctant to move. As evening approached, mist gathered between the trees. Daniel checked his map twice. According to every survey, the farmhouse should have disappeared decades ago. Yet there it was, standing exactly where every forgotten story claimed it would be, waiting quietly, as though it had known he was coming. And somewhere beyond those weathered walls, inside rooms no one had entered for years, something was already remembering his name.
Daniel stood motionless beneath the porch roof. The rain continued to fall behind him, steady, gentle, almost comforting. For a long moment, he simply listened. The forest remained silent. No birds, no insects. Not even the wind seemed willing to disturb the darkness surrounding the old house. It was as if the entire world had quietly stepped back, allowing only this place to exist. The front door remained open, waiting, not inviting, simply waiting. Daniel finally crossed the threshold. The wooden floor answered with a soft creak beneath his boots. The sound echoed farther than it should have, disappearing somewhere deep inside the endless hallway. He closed the door behind him. The outside world vanished instantly. Only silence remained. The air carried the faint scent of old wood, dust, and something strangely familiar, not unpleasant, almost comforting, like the smell of a house you visited once as a child but could never quite remember. A single lamp rested on a small table near the entrance. Its yellow light glowed softly. Though Daniel could not find any electrical cord connected to it, he frowned. The house had no visible electricity, yet the light remained steady, warm, peaceful, as if someone had lit it only moments ago. He whispered to himself, "That's impossible." His own voice sounded unusually distant. The walls seemed to absorb every word, refusing to return an echo. He removed his backpack, placing it carefully beside the staircase.
The stairs curved upward into darkness. The second floor disappeared completely beyond the shadows. For reasons he could not explain, he decided not to look up for too long. Instead, he began exploring the first floor. The living room felt untouched by time. A fireplace stood against the far wall. Ashes rested neatly inside, as though yesterday's fire had only recently faded. An old rocking chair faced the empty hearth. It moved, very slightly, forward, then back, almost too gently to notice. Daniel stopped walking. The chair slowed, then became perfectly still. He smiled nervously. The floor isn't level. At least it sounded like a reasonable explanation. At least he wanted it to be. A bookshelf covered one entire wall. Hundreds of books stood perfectly arranged. Not a single one showed signs of dust. He reached towards the nearest volume. Before touching it, he noticed something unusual. Every book carried a person's name, not a title, a name. Emma Collins, Samuel Price, Helen Brooks, Michael Carter. There were hundreds of them. Each spine displayed a different name. Daniel pulled one from the shelf. The cover felt warm. He slowly opened the first page. It contained only one sentence. She never stopped looking back. Nothing else. The remaining pages were blank. He replaced the book carefully. Another name caught his attention. Thomas Gray. He opened it. This time, the first page read, "He almost remembered." Blank pages followed. Daniel swallowed quietly. His heartbeat had become noticeably louder, not because he felt afraid, because the house seemed interested, watching, listening, waiting for him to notice something. He turned towards the fireplace again. The rocking chair had moved, only a few inches. Now it faced him directly. Daniel stared. Neither fear nor panic filled his mind. Only one impossible question. Who turned it? Silence answered. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Finally, he laughed softly. "I've been driving all day. Maybe I'm just tired." The words sounded convincing enough. He wanted to believe them. The kitchen stood beyond the living room. It looked surprisingly modern compared to the rest of the house. Copper pans hung neatly above the counter. A kettle rested quietly beside an old stove. Everything appeared clean, ready to be used. A small handwritten note lay on the dining table. Daniel picked it up. The ink looked fresh. The ink had not faded. It simply said, "Dinner is at 7. There was no signature, no date. Daniel checked his watch. The digital display read 6:58 p.m. Daniel smiled uneasily. Someone's playing a joke. Even as he spoke, he already knew there was no one else inside the house, or at least no one he had seen. Exactly 1 minute later, a soft sound echoed from somewhere behind him, a single plate being gently placed onto a wooden table. Daniel turned slowly. The dining table, which had been completely empty, now held one white ceramic plate. Steam drifted quietly into the air, fresh, warm, as though the meal had just been served. Daniel stood frozen. The house had prepared dinner, and somehow it already knew he had arrived. The steam continued to rise, slowly, silently, from the untouched dinner plate. Daniel didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the meal. Fresh bread, a bowl of warm soup, roasted vegetables. Everything looked as though someone had prepared it only seconds ago. Yet, the house remained completely silent. No footsteps, no voices, no closing doors. Nothing. He stepped closer, carefully. The warmth from the soup reached his face. It was real, not an illusion, not a dream. His stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten since early afternoon, but instinct whispered, "Don't touch it." Instead, Daniel looked around the dining room once more. Every chair remained empty. Every window reflected only darkness. No movement, no shadows, only himself, standing beneath the old chandelier. Then he noticed something strange. There were 6 chairs around the table. 5 were covered with a thin layer of dust. One, the chair directly opposite him, was perfectly clean, as though someone had been sitting there, waiting. Daniel slowly stepped back. The warmth from the soup remained where it was. "I'll pass," he whispered. Almost immediately, the candle at the center of the table flickered just once. Then everything became still again. Daniel couldn't explain why, but somehow it felt like disappointment. Not anger, not resentment, simply disappointment. He quietly left the dining room. The hallway felt darker than before. The little lamp near the entrance still glowed softly. Its warm light seemed to guide him back toward the enormous bookshelf. The names he couldn't stop thinking about. Hundreds of books, hundreds of people, each one carrying only a single sentence. He reached for another. Margaret Lewis. The cover felt surprisingly warm. He opened the first page. It read, "She forgave everyone except herself." The remaining pages were blank. Daniel closed the book. Another name, Arthur Hale. First page. He waited 1 minute too long. Blank. Again. Another. Emily Stone. She almost opened the letter. Blank. Every book followed the same pattern. 1 name, 1 sentence. An entire lifetime reduced to a single memory. Daniel stood silently. The idea felt impossible, yet it also felt strangely beautiful, as though someone's entire existence could be distilled into one unforgettable truth. His fingers moved almost automatically across the shelf. Then they stopped. A familiar surname. Morgan. His own surname. Daniel froze. Slowly, he pulled the book free. It felt heavier than all the others. His heartbeat became louder. He stared at the cover. The name read, Daniel Morgan. His hands trembled slightly. "No," he whispered. "This isn't possible." He had never been here before. No one knew he was coming. The cabin hadn't even appeared on modern maps. Then why was his name already waiting? He opened the cover. The first page was blank. Nothing. Empty paper. He turned the next page. Blank. Another. Blank. Every page completely blank. Daniel frowned. Unlike every other book, this one wasn't finished. It was waiting to be written. A cold sensation moved through the room. Not a draft, something quieter, as though the house itself had taken a slow breath. Behind him,
A floorboard creaked. Daniel spun around. No one. The hallway remained empty. The lamp still glowed peacefully. His breathing slowly settled. "You've been alone too long," he told himself. His own voice sounded uncertain. As he returned the unfinished book to the shelf, something caught his eye. The other books had changed. Not all of them, just one. The book belonging to Thomas Gray. Earlier, its first sentence had read, "He almost remembered." Now, the page said something different. "He remembered too late." Daniel stared at the words. He was certain, absolutely certain, that wasn't what it had said before. He reached toward the page. The ink was dry, old, as though those words had existed for years. His pulse quickened. The books weren't simply recording memories. They were changing, slowly, quietly, as if someone's story continued even after the book had been placed upon the shelf. Then, from somewhere above, came a sound. A single footstep. Soft, deliberate. Not the random settling of an old house. A person, walking, very slowly, across the second floor. Daniel looked towards the staircase. Another step. Then another. Whoever or whatever was upstairs was in no hurry. It simply walked from one end of the hallway to the other, then stopped. Complete silence returned. Daniel's mind searched desperately for a reasonable explanation. An animal, old pipes, wood expanding in the cold, anything, everything, except the obvious. His eyes drifted upward. The darkness at the top of the staircase seemed deeper now, almost alive. And then a voice, so soft he almost believed it had come from inside his own thoughts. It spoke only 4 words. "Your room is ready." Daniel's breath caught. The voice wasn't threatening. It wasn't angry. It sounded kind, patient, like someone welcoming a guest who had finally arrived home. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, the old house waited. And somewhere on the second floor, a bedroom door slowly began to open.
Daniel remained perfectly still. The bedroom door at the end of the upstairs hallway had opened only a few inches. No footsteps followed. No shadow appeared. Only darkness, waiting beyond the doorway. For several long seconds, he simply listened. The house had become strangely quiet again. Not empty, just patient. The staircase stood before him. Old oak. Its polished railing reflected the warm glow from the lamp below. Every instinct told him to leave, to grab his backpack, open the front door, and drive until sunrise. Yet another feeling, one he couldn't explain, pulled him toward the second floor. It wasn't curiosity alone. It felt personal, as though the house already knew something about him that he had forgotten himself. Daniel placed one foot on the first step. It creaked softly, then another. The climb felt much longer than it looked from below. Each step echoed gently, disappearing into the darkness above. Halfway up, he paused. The air had changed. It felt warmer. The faint scent of rain had disappeared. Instead, there was something else. Old paper, lavender, fresh coffee. 3 completely different scents somehow existing together. Daniel frowned. Each smell reminded him of someone, but he couldn't remember who. The memories hovered just beyond reach. He continued climbing. At the top, the hallway stretched farther than it should have, much farther. From outside, the house had looked modest. 2 stories, perhaps 6 rooms, but the hallway before him seemed impossibly long. Doors lined both sides, one after another, perfectly identical. None carried names, none carried numbers. Only the final door, the one that had opened by itself, remained slightly ajar. Everything else was closed. Daniel took a slow breath. The wooden floor beneath him felt strangely warm, not heated, simply lived in, as if countless footsteps had crossed it only moments before. He walked toward the open door. His own footsteps sounded unnaturally soft, almost respectful. When he reached the doorway, he hesitated. The room beyond was lit by a single bedside lamp. Warm golden light filled the space. It looked ordinary. A neatly made bed, a wooden desk, a bookshelf, a small fireplace, a rocking chair beside the window. Everything appeared comfortable, peaceful. Nothing suggested danger. Yet, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the house had prepared this room specifically for him. He stepped inside. The temperature immediately changed. Warmer, comforting, the kind of warmth found only in places where people once felt safe. On the bedside table rested an old leather journal. Beside it lay a silver pocket watch. Neither showed a trace of dust. Daniel picked up the watch. It had stopped exactly at 11:47. He pressed the small button. The cover opened with a gentle click. Inside, instead of a photograph, there was a tiny handwritten sentence. "Time only leaves those who choose to forget." Daniel whispered the words aloud. For reasons he couldn't explain, they hurt. Not physically, emotionally. Like hearing advice he should have remembered years ago. He placed the watch back onto the table, then turned toward the bookshelf. Unlike the library downstairs, these books carried no names, only years. 1948, 1949, 1950, 1951, 1952. Each book represented a single year. Daniel reached for 2004. The cover opened effortlessly. Inside, there were photographs, not printed, real photographs, families, birthdays, children laughing beneath summer trees, old couples sitting on front porches, friends gathered around fireplaces. Every photograph captured an ordinary moment, yet none included names, only happiness, only memories. He turned another page, another forgotten moment. His mother reading bedtime stories, his first bicycle, his grandmother baking apple pie, memories he hadn't thought about in decades. One after another, they returned, not like dreams, like reality. The room wasn't showing him photographs. It was giving him back pieces of his own life. Daniel closed the book. His breathing had become uneven. What is this place? No answer came. Instead, the fireplace beside him crackled softly. A fire had appeared, small, gentle, warm. He was certain there had been no fire seconds earlier. The flames danced quietly, casting moving shadows across the walls. One shadow didn't move with the fire. Daniel noticed it immediately. Every other shadow shifted naturally. One remained perfectly still, human-shaped, standing silently near the bedroom door. Daniel slowly turned. The doorway was empty. He looked back toward the wall. The motionless shadow was gone. Only the fire remained. Only silence. Then, from somewhere farther down the hallway, came the faint sound of a child laughing. Just once, soft, happy, as though remembering something beautiful. The sound faded. Then another voice, older this time, spoke almost too quietly to hear. He's beginning to remember. Daniel's heartbeat slowed, not from fear, from realization. The house wasn't trying to trap him. It was trying to return something he had lost. But one question remained. If the house could remember every forgotten moment, then why was his own book downstairs still completely blank?
The laughter faded until the room became silent once again. Daniel stood beside the fireplace, unable to pull his eyes away from the old photo album resting on the desk. His hands still trembled, not from fear, from recognition. The house had returned memories he didn't even know he had lost. The fishing trip, his grandmother's kitchen, his father's laugh. Each memory had felt perfectly real, more real than many moments he had lived only a week ago. He slowly looked around the bedroom. Everything remained peaceful. The fire burned quietly. Rain tapped gently against the window. The rocking chair beside the glass remained perfectly still. It almost felt safe. Then he noticed something. The family photograph on the desk. He was certain it hadn't been there before. It rested in an old wooden frame. A smiling family stood in front of the very same house. A mother, a father, a young girl, and a little boy. They looked happy, completely ordinary. Daniel picked up the frame. The date carved into the bottom read, October 12th, 1913. More than 60 years before his arrival. He studied every face. The parents smiled naturally. The little girl held a small doll, but the little boy felt strangely familiar. Daniel leaned closer. The child's eyes looked exactly like his own. Not similar, exactly. The same calm expression, the same crooked smile, even the tiny scar above the left eyebrow. Daniel instinctively touched his forehead. He had carried that scar since childhood. His breathing slowed. "No," he whispered. "That can't be." He turned the photograph over. Something had been written on the back, in faded ink, barely visible. Every visitor sees themselves eventually. A cold shiver traveled down his spine, not because the message frightened him, because it sounded like a warning. Suddenly, the room grew quieter. The fire no longer crackled. The rain no longer tapped against the window. Even his own breathing seemed distant. The silence became complete. Then, very gently, the bedroom door clicked shut behind him. Daniel turned immediately. No one stood there. He crossed the room, tried the handle. It wouldn't move. Locked. He frowned. This isn't funny. He pushed harder.
Nothing. The old wood refused to open. He stepped backwards. For the first time that evening, a small feeling of unease settled inside him. Not panic, just uncertainty. Then something caught his attention. The mirror above the fireplace. His reflection looked normal, tired, slightly pale. Rainwater still clung to his jacket. He stared for a moment. Then his reflection blinked. A fraction of a second after he did, Daniel froze. He raised one hand. The reflection followed, perfectly. He lowered it again.
Still normal, he sighed quietly. You need sleep. The long drive, the strange house, the endless silence. His mind was playing tricks. He looked away from the mirror only for a second. When he looked back, his reflection was no longer looking at him. It was looking toward the bedroom door. Daniel's pulse quickened. Slowly, very slowly, his reflection lifted one finger, pointing toward the hallway outside. Daniel turned instantly. The bedroom door was now standing open. He hadn't heard it unlock. He hadn't heard it open. The hallway beyond was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, his reflection had returned to normal, looking directly at him, as though nothing had happened. Daniel said nothing. Instead, he quietly stepped into the hallway. The air felt cooler now. The long corridor stretched endlessly into darkness. Every closed door looked identical. Every shadow remained still. Then, a faint melody drifted through the silence. Someone was humming, softly, an old lullaby. The sound came from somewhere farther down the hall. Daniel followed it. Each step echoed gently beneath his boots. The melody became clearer, beautiful, sad, comforting, almost familiar. He stopped beside another door. Unlike the others, this one was slightly open. Warm light spilled across the floor. The humming stopped. Daniel pushed the door open. Inside stood a nursery. An old wooden cradle rested near the window. Tiny shoes lined the floor. A rocking horse stood quietly beside the fireplace. Everything appeared untouched, as though a family had simply stepped outside, planning to return any minute. Then the cradle moved, very slowly, forward, back, forward, forward, back. Daniel stared. No wind, no movement, only the gentle rhythm of the cradle. He approached carefully. His heartbeat echoed inside the silent room. When he reached the cradle, he looked inside. It was empty, except for a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. Only one sentence had been written. Some memories are too small to remember until someone remembers them for you. Daniel read the words twice. Something about them felt important, deeply important, as though the house wasn't speaking in riddles, but trying, patiently, to teach him something. Then he heard another sound, a camera shutter. Click. The sound came from behind him. Daniel turned instantly. No one. The nursery remained empty, but the old family photograph, which had been lying safely in his jacket pocket, was no longer there.
Instead, it rested on the small table beside the cradle. One detail had changed. Before, there had been 4 people in the picture. Now, there were 5. Standing quietly at the far edge of the photograph was Daniel, wearing the same clothes he was wearing tonight. And unlike everyone else in the picture, he wasn't smiling. He was staring directly at whoever would look at the photograph next.
Daniel stared at the photograph, unable to breathe. Only seconds ago, he had been standing inside the nursery. Now, he was standing inside the photograph as well. Every detail was identical. The same dark jacket, the same rain-soaked boots, even the flashlight hanging from his belt. Whoever had taken the picture had captured him before he had ever entered the room. He reached for the frame. The glass felt cold, far colder than anything else inside the house. As he lifted it, another detail caught his attention. The people in the photograph were no longer looking toward the camera. Every one of them, the father, the mother, the little girl, the little boy, and now Daniel, were all staring toward the second-floor hallway, toward something outside the frame, something the photograph refused to show. Daniel slowly lowered it. His mind searched desperately for logic. Someone could have altered the image. Someone could have hidden cameras inside the house. Someone could be playing an elaborate prank. But every explanation collapsed beneath one simple fact. The photograph had changed while it was inside his own pocket. No trick could explain that. He carefully placed the frame back onto the table. "I've seen enough." His voice sounded calm, almost detached. The words were meant for himself. He needed fresh air. He needed daylight. He needed to leave. He walked quickly into the hallway. This time, he didn't stop to examine the doors. He headed directly toward the staircase, the front door, his car, the highway, anything beyond these walls. Halfway down the stairs, he paused. His backpack was gone. He looked around the entrance hall. The lamp still glowed softly. The bookshelf remained exactly where it had been. The rocking chair still faced the fireplace, but the backpack had disappeared. Daniel searched every corner, behind the staircase, inside the living room, near the dining table. Nothing. Only one object remained: the old brass key the elderly woman had handed him at the general store. It rested neatly on the entrance table, exactly where his backpack should have been. Daniel picked it up. It felt warmer than before, almost alive. Tiny symbols had appeared along its handle. He was certain they hadn't been there earlier. They looked less like letters and more like tiny branches, twisting together, forming unfamiliar shapes. Without thinking, Daniel slipped the key into his jacket pocket. The moment he did, the grandfather clock in the hallway began to chime. Once, twice, 3 times. By the 12th chime, something changed. Every clock Daniel could see stopped. The grandfather clock, the pocket watch upstairs, even his own wristwatch, all frozen at exactly 11:47. Daniel frowned. What happened at 11:47? The house remained silent. Then a voice answered. Not from behind him, not upstairs, not outside. It came from every room at once, soft, gentle, almost compassionate. Someone chose to forget. Daniel's heartbeat slowed. The words lingered in the air like the final note of a song. Someone chose to forget, not someone
forgot. Someone chose to. There was a difference, a very important difference. His thoughts drifted back to the unfinished book downstairs. His own name, blank pages, waiting. The house wasn't recording the past. It was waiting for a decision, a memory that had never been written. Daniel returned to the library. The shelves stood exactly as before. Hundreds of names, hundreds of stories. He reached for his own book again. Daniel Morgan. The leather cover felt warmer now, almost welcoming. He opened the first page. His breath caught.
The page was no longer blank. A single sentence had appeared. He came looking for history, but history had been waiting for him. Daniel slowly turned the page. Another sentence, but history had been waiting for him. The next page remained empty. No more words, just those two. The book was writing itself, one page at a time. As events unfolded, he closed it carefully. Then, without warning, every book surrounding him shifted, not falling, not moving, simply opening. Hundreds of covers lifting together, thousands of blank pages fluttering softly. The room filled with the quiet sound of turning paper, like leaves moving through a distant forest. Daniel stood perfectly still. No fear remained, only awe. It felt beautiful. Every page stopped turning at the exact same moment. Each book displayed its single sentence. Hundreds of lives, hundreds of forgotten truths. Then another sentence slowly appeared, not inside one book, inside all of them. The ink spread across every page as though written by an invisible hand. Daniel watched, unable to look away. The words were identical. The house does not take memories. Silence. Another line appeared. It keeps the memories people cannot bear to keep. Daniel felt the room grow warmer. Suddenly, everything made sense. The visitors hadn't been cursed. They hadn't been robbed. Somewhere, at some point, each of them had carried a memory too painful to live with. Regret, loss, grief, guilt. The house had accepted those memories and carried them, so they no longer had to. It wasn't feeding on people. It was protecting them at an unimaginable cost. Then Daniel noticed one final sentence appearing only inside his own book. The ink formed slowly, letter by letter. The question is not what you came here to find. A pause. Then the last words emerged. The question is, what did you ask this house to forget? Daniel's face slowly lost all color, because for the first time that night, he realized something impossible. He couldn't remember why he had chosen this house. He remembered hearing the legend. He remembered packing his car. He remembered the long drive, but the real reason that had brought him here was completely gone. Somewhere, deep inside his own mind, there was an empty space, a memory that had already disappeared long before he ever crossed the front door. And, for the first time, Daniel began to wonder if this was not his first visit. The question refused to leave Daniel's mind.
What did you ask this house to forget? He read the sentence again, then again. Nothing came back. He searched every corner of his memory, every reason that had brought him to Black Pine Forest. He remembered receiving the story from a colleague. He remembered packing his equipment. He remembered the long drive through the mountains. But everything before that felt strangely blurred, like reading a book with its first chapter missing. Daniel closed the leather journal. The library had become silent once again. Every book rested neatly on its shelf. Every page had stopped turning. It was almost as though nothing unusual had happened. Almost. He reached into his pocket, removing the brass key. The strange symbols engraved along its handle had changed again. This time, they almost resembled handwriting. Not words, just fragments, broken pieces of letters, as if the key itself was trying to remember something. Then, the grandfather clock struck once, a single chime. Daniel looked toward it. The hands hadn't moved. They still pointed to 11:47. Yet, the clock had spoken. Slowly, another sound joined it. A door opening somewhere downstairs. Not upstairs, not behind him. Below, a place he hadn't explored. Daniel followed the sound. His footsteps echoed softly as he crossed the entrance hall. The kitchen remained exactly as before. The untouched dinner still rested upon the table. The soup no longer steamed. The bread had become cold. It looked as though hours had passed. Then he noticed something hidden beside the pantry door. A narrow staircase. It descended into darkness. Daniel stopped. He was sure that staircase hadn't been there earlier. He raised his flashlight. The beam disappeared into the darkness below. No floor, no walls, just blackness. A cold breath of air drifted upward. Unlike the warmth filling the rest of the house, this air carried the scent of damp stone, old paper, and rain. Very old rain. The brass key grew warm inside his hand. Without thinking, Daniel began to descend. One step, then another. The wooden stairs soon became stone. The temperature dropped with every step. His flashlight barely reached the walls. They weren't wooden anymore. They were carved directly into rock. Ancient rock, far older than the farmhouse above. The silence felt different here, heavier, as though every sound had been buried beneath decades of forgotten voices. Finally, his feet reached solid ground. A long underground corridor stretched ahead. Stone walls disappeared into darkness. Oil lamps burned quietly every few yards. None should be lit, yet every flame burned steadily, waiting. Daniel walked carefully. The corridor eventually opened into a circular chamber. He stopped immediately. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of small wooden boxes covered every wall, from floor to ceiling, perfectly arranged. Each box carried a single brass nameplate. No dates, only names. Emma Collins, Thomas Gray, Margaret Lewis, Arthur Hale. Every name he had seen upstairs was here. But these were not books. They were
Memory boxes. Daniel approached the nearest one. It was no larger than a shoebox. A tiny keyhole rested beneath the nameplate. His brass key fit perfectly. He hesitated, then turned it. The lock clicked. Inside, there was no photograph, no letter, no diary, only sound. The moment the lid opened, a little girl's laughter filled the chamber, bright, joyful, completely alive.
Daniel heard a woman's voice. "Come on, Emma. You're going to miss the fireworks." The child laughed again. Then, silence. Nothing else. Daniel slowly closed the box. His heart raced. The box hadn't stored objects. It had stored a memory, a real one. He opened another. Thomas Gray. This time, he heard waves crashing against a shoreline. A man whispered quietly, "I forgive you." Another voice answered, "I know." The memory ended. Daniel closed the lid with trembling hands. Every box contained a single forgotten moment. Not the painful memories, the precious ones, the moments people were most afraid of forever. The house had preserved them, perfectly, untouched by time. Daniel turned slowly. There were thousands more, an entire lifetime for every person who had ever entered. Then his flashlight settled upon one box, resting alone at the center of the chamber. Unlike the others, it carried no dust. The brass plate reflected the light. Engraved upon it were two words, Daniel Morgan. His breath caught. The box waited quietly, already unlocked. He had never been here. He knew that, didn't he? Slowly, he lifted the lid. Nothing happened. The box was empty, completely empty. No sound, no memory, only silence. Then a voice spoke behind him, not from the darkness, very close, close enough to feel its breath. "You already took yours." Daniel spun around. No one. The chamber remained empty. The lamps burned peacefully. The shelves stood motionless. His own breathing echoed against the stone walls. Then the same voice returned, gentle, kind, almost familiar. "You asked us to keep it safe." Daniel felt every muscle in his body become still. "Who are you?" he whispered. For the first time, the house answered clearly. "We are what people leave behind." The lamps flickered together. Every flame dimmed, then brightened once more. At that exact moment, every memory box in the chamber began to whisper. Not loudly, softly. Thousands of voices, laughing, crying, singing, saying goodbye, telling someone they loved them, speaking final words, first words, forgotten words. The chamber filled with the sound of thousands of human lives. Daniel stood at the center, surrounded by memories that no longer belonged to anyone. Then, all the voices stopped together. Absolute silence returned. Only one voice remained, a woman's voice, soft, warm, very close. "Daniel, we've been waiting for you to remember why you came back." Daniel closed his eyes, and for the briefest moment, he saw a face, a smiling woman standing beneath autumn leaves. She reached for his hand. She whispered, "I know you'll forget me."
So let the house remember until you're ready. Daniel's eyes flew open. The vision vanished, but one thing remained. A single name echoing inside his mind. A name he had not remembered until now. Elizabeth. And with that one forgotten name, the first crack appeared in the memory he had buried.
Elizabeth. The name echoed in Daniel's mind. Again and again. It felt familiar, painfully familiar, like a melody he had once known by heart, but had not heard for many years. He whispered it aloud. Elizabeth. The underground chamber answered, with silence. The thousands of memory boxes remained perfectly still. The warm voice had disappeared. Only the quiet flames of the oil lamps continued to dance against the ancient stone walls. Daniel looked down at his empty memory box. His name still gleamed across the brass plate. Daniel Morgan. Empty. Completely empty. Yet, somehow, it felt heavier than every other box in the room. He reached inside. His fingertips brushed against smooth wood. Nothing else. Then, he noticed something carved at the bottom. A single sentence, so faint it was almost invisible. Some memories cannot be stored. He stared at the words. What does that mean? No answer came. Instead, the brass key in his pocket became warm once more, warmer than before. Daniel removed it slowly. The strange symbols engraved along its surface had changed again. This time, they were no longer random. They formed an address. Not a street, not a town. A room. Room 11. Daniel frowned. He had explored the second floor. There had been many doors, but none with numbers. Still, the key seemed certain. Room 11. The lamps around the chamber flickered together. Then, one by one, they began to extinguish themselves. The farthest lamp disappeared first. Darkness swallowed the corridor beyond. Another flame vanished. Then another. The darkness moved slowly towards him. Not threatening, simply advancing, as though the house wished him to leave. Daniel climbed the stone staircase without hesitation. When he reached the kitchen again, the underground passage had vanished. There was only an ordinary pantry wall, no staircase, no stone corridor, no hidden chamber. Only silence. He looked back once. Nothing. Had he imagined it? He reached into his pocket. The brass key remained there. So did the dust from the stone steps still clinging to his boots. No, it had been real. Every moment. The house was simply choosing what could be seen, and by whom. The grandfather clock still stood motionless. 11:47. Always 11:47. Daniel walked slowly toward the staircase. This time, he counted the bedroom doors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. He stopped. The hallway ended. There was no 11th door.
Only a blank wooden wall. He sighed quietly. I knew it. I've finally lost my mind. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A tiny brass number.
hidden beneath layers of old paint. 11. Daniel stepped closer. His heartbeat slowed. The wall wasn't a wall. It was a door. The outline had been painted over so many times it had disappeared completely. He touched it gently. The wood felt warm. The brass key slid into the hidden lock without resistance. One quiet click. The door opened inward. A cool breeze drifted across his face. The room beyond was unlike anything else inside the house. There was no furniture, no fireplace, no photographs. Only white walls, a single wooden chair, and one enormous window overlooking black pine forest. Moonlight poured inside, silver, peaceful. The room felt empty, almost unfinished. Daniel stepped inside. The hidden door closed softly behind him. For several moments, nothing happened. Then, the window changed. It no longer reflected the forest. Instead, it became a memory. Daniel watched, as though looking through invisible glass. A younger version of himself appeared, perhaps 8 years earlier, standing beside a hospital bed. His shoulders were shaking. His hands held someone else's, a woman's hand. Elizabeth. She smiled weakly. Even from across the room, Daniel recognized her eyes, kind, patient, full of quiet strength. She spoke softly. "I need you to promise me something." The younger Daniel nodded. Tears rolled down his face. "I don't want to forget you." Elizabeth smiled. "You won't, but if remembering me keeps you from living, then you have to let me go." The younger Daniel shook his head desperately. "I can't." "You can." She reached into her pocket, removing an old brass key. The same key. She placed it into his hand. "If the grief ever becomes too heavy, take this to the house. It knows how to carry memories until you're ready to remember her again." The memory blurred. Hospital machines faded into silence. Daniel stepped closer to the window. His own reflection appeared beside the younger version of himself. Then, everything disappeared. The room became empty once more. Daniel staggered backward. His knees nearly gave way. Elizabeth. She had been real. Not a dream, not imagination. She had been his wife, the woman he had loved more than anything, and she had died. Years ago. The grief had been unbearable, so unbearable that he had done exactly what she had asked. He had come to the house. He had asked it to hold the memories until he was strong enough to remember her again. A tear slipped silently down his face, then another. For the first time since entering the house, Daniel understood the truth. He hadn't come here by accident. He hadn't come to investigate a legend. He had come to finish a promise he could no longer remember making. Behind him, the hidden door slowly opened. The same gentle voice spoke once more. "We never forgot her." A pause. Then, "We were only waiting for you to remember her yourself." Daniel closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he spoke her name without fear. Elizabeth. The room grew warmer. Somewhere downstairs, his unfinished book quietly turned to its final chapter.
Daniel remained inside room 11, unable to move. The tears upon his face had long since dried. Yet, the ache inside his chest felt strangely lighter. Not because the pain had disappeared, because for the first time in years, the pain
finally belonged to him again. He remembered Elizabeth, her laughter, her voice, the way she always reached for his hand, even when neither of them spoke. The house had never stolen those memories. It had simply protected them until he was ready to carry them once more. The hidden door stood quietly open. Beyond it, the long hallway waited, warm, silent, almost peaceful. Daniel stepped outside. Something had changed. The long hallway no longer felt endless. The shadows no longer seemed alive. Even the old wooden floor sounded different beneath his feet. Not lonely, lived in, as though the house itself had taken a slow breath of relief. He walked downstairs. The grandfather clock still stood in the entrance hall. Its hands remained frozen. 11:47. Daniel stopped before it. For hours, that single time had haunted him. Now it felt familiar, almost painfully so. His fingers brushed against the polished wood. Without warning, another memory returned. Not gently, not slowly, all at once. A hospital corridor, rain beating against tall windows, doctors speaking quietly, a nurse placing a small envelope into Daniel's trembling hands. Inside, the same brass key, a handwritten note, Elizabeth's handwriting, neat, patient, beautiful. It read, "If this hurts too much, take it back to the house. One day, when you're ready, come for me." Daniel remembered collapsing into a chair, unable to breathe, unable to think, unable to imagine a tomorrow without her. Then the clock on the hospital wall stopped. Exactly 11:47 p.m., the moment Elizabeth's heart had stopped beating. Daniel opened his eyes. The hallway returned. The grandfather clock still pointed toward that impossible hour. The house hadn't chosen the time. He had. Without realizing it, he had frozen that moment forever, because part of him had never wanted time to continue. A gentle voice drifted through the silence. "We keep time where broken hearts leave it." Daniel smiled sadly. "So that's why." The voice answered softly. "Yes." He closed his eyes for a moment, then asked, "How many people have come here?" The house seemed to consider the question. Finally, it replied, "Enough to fill every room with hope." Daniel looked around the quiet hallway. Every book, every memory box, every photograph, every forgotten sentence, they had all belonged to ordinary people, people who loved deeply, people who lost deeply. The house had never belonged to ghosts. It belonged to grief.